Well, we're going to go ahead and give folks some time to get in. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Sharon Bonney. I'm the CEO for the Coalition on Adult Basic Education, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our session today with Amanda Bergson-Chilcock. I'm just very, very excited to have you hear from Amanda. Many of you know Amanda, know the great work that she does, but I want to have a special focus today on the Digital Equity Act and making sure that all the states are at the table. So Amanda has graciously agreed to do this webinar for us, specifically for state leaders, so for our state advocates, fellows, for our state association presidents, and for state directors. And I know that we have 49 of the 50 states represented here, which is exciting. And I know also that we have a number of folks that have registered and will be watching this after the fact as well, which is great. And at this point, I want to turn this over to Amanda to take it away, and just encourage folks to introduce yourself in the chat box, tell us what state you're from. And Amanda, thank you so much for this session.
Well, thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Sharon. It's so terrific to be here, and we appreciate COAB's leadership in lifting up this issue. So I have a handful of slides I'm going to share with you all today, and a couple of links I'll drop into the chat. But really, this is the take-home message that I hope that you all hear. Your state is about to get, in the next year, a significant chunk of money from the federal government to support digital equity, broadband access, digital devices, and most importantly, digital skills. And your state is on the hook to make sure that a list of covered populations under the new legislation is well served. And there is fantastic overlap between the communities of folks that we serve in adult education and the covered populations that need to be served under this new legislation. So if you leave with nothing else today, please leave with the understanding that there's new money coming into your state. It can be used to support adult education programs, and it can support your work in helping people build digital skills. So that's my big take-home message. I'm going to walk through a very short, about less than a dozen slides here, presentation to give you a big picture overview, and then I'll drop a couple of resources into the chat, and then I'd just like to open it up for questions and conversation. So the federal government, back last year, Congress passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which some of you may have heard of as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA. Within that law, there is $65 billion for broadband access and related digital equity services. So a big chunk of that, $42 billion, is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program. Another big chunk of that is almost $3 billion for the Digital Equity Act. Your state is going to get formula funding that will go to a state agency, and that state agency will then be able to re-grant down to the local level. And your state will be eligible, and organizations within your state will be eligible to apply directly to the federal government for competitive grants. So two different kinds of money will be flowing to your state. First, that formula funding that will go to a state agency and then get re-granted down to the local level. And second, the competitive grants, where state agencies, nonprofits, and others can apply directly to the federal government in response to what the feds call a NOFO, a notice of funding opportunity, which is similar to a request for proposals. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about both of these funding streams. And then I'm going to open it up to ask you what you're seeing and hearing in your state and the degree to which you may be engaged in these conversations already. So the first stage of this process is that your state is going to get somewhere between $500,000 and a couple $1,000,000 for a planning process for its digital equity 5-year plan and $5 million for its BEAD planning. Now, the federal officials are very fond of saying BEAD without equity is just bad. And that's kind of a silly pun, but it is a serious reference to the fact that the federal government is very clear. They want to make sure that rural communities are well served. They want to make sure that low income people are well served, folks who are indigenous, folks who are incarcerated, folks who are veterans, people of color, low literacy, limited English proficiency. There's a whole universe of people that Congress has written into the law as priority or covered populations, and that the federal agency overseeing this funding is thinking about. The other thing to know is that this money is coming out of the US Department of Commerce. It's not coming from the Department of Education or the Department of Labor. Most of us in the adult ed world are very familiar with the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or AFLA, Title II funding that comes through the Department of Ed under the WIOA legislation that Ed implements in partnership with labor. This is the Department of Commerce. They are experts in serving business. They are not experts in education, and they would be the first to tell you that. So this is a really wonderful opportunity for us as educators to get our vision, our expertise, and our work out in front of our partners at the federal level and their equivalents at your state level to make sure that they're aware of the expertise that adult education can bring to the table. So the planning period that your state is involved in right now, your state is developing its 5-year BEAD plan for this broadband money and the 5-year digital equity plan. The planning period will last for up to 12 months, right? So your state will have up to a year to do this. A couple of states have passed state level legislation that gives them a faster timeline. Washington State in particular is operating on a faster timeline. But for most states, you're going to have a year. Your governor will have appointed an agency that's going to lead this process. In some cases, it will be the same agency leading the 5-year digital equity plan and the 5-year action plan for BEAD. In other cases, it will be 2 separate agencies. It might be your state broadband office, if you have such a thing. It could be your state library. So in both Utah and Idaho, state library folks are at the lead of the digital equity work, for example. So whichever agency your governor has appointed will be rolling up their sleeves to lead this process. And these are supposed to happen in alignment. Your state's BEAD plan has to include a section on digital equity, and the federal government has said, hey, it's fine with us if you just drop your digital equity plan into your BEAD plan as the chapter that's going to focus on digital equity. So I keep saying these words, digital equity, broadband. What do these even really mean for us as adult educators? Well, we've all lived through the past few years of the pandemic, and we've all experienced what it's like for our learners and our staff not to have digital equity. Maybe they live in neighborhoods where broadband is not available or not affordable. Maybe they have a shared digital device with multiple other family members, or a Chromebook that they have to give back to the school district at the end of their child's school year. Maybe they don't feel confident navigating a desktop or laptop computer because their only digital experience has been with a smartphone. Adult education has a really powerful role to play in helping people build the skills they need and in educating your fellow state officials and other state leaders about the role of adult education in providing the digital skills that your state is on the hook to provide under this new legislation. So this is a way to get new money into the adult education system Right now, there is no expectation, and there'll be an opportunity for public comment on this. You could create programs here that are part of your AFLA funded work, or you could create programs that are separate from your AFLA funded work. Because right now there's no expectation that learners would have to be reported through the national reporting system, or that data collection would look the same as it does under WIOA. In fact, the Commerce Department staff have been very clear that they want the data collection to be useful but not burdensome on states and localities. So for some of you, this is all kind of old hat information. You know all this. You've already been at the table with your state agency peers over the last few months. You may be already engaged in the public engagement sessions or listening sessions that your state is planning. For others, this might be the first time you're even hearing about this legislation. So that's my first recommendation. If you're not already talking to the state agency that's in charge of digital equity planning in your state, make sure you connect with them. And if you don't know what that agency is, you can check in with your governor's office, or you can feel free to contact me. I have the names of some of those state agencies, not all of them, but I can check and try to find out for you. So far, the federal government has publicly announced 2 of the planning grants, one to Ohio, one to Louisiana, and we expect that a lot more will be coming in the next few weeks. If you are participating at the table with your state peers, we have a set of recommendations for adult educators about digital equity planning that we hope will be really useful to you. If you're not there, but you'd like to be part of that conversation, I'd love to talk to you about how we can help support that. So, one thing that might help you get to the planning table is if you help your state agency peers with something that might be keeping them up at night. So for example, they're going to be on the hook for talking about how digital skills are going to be measured. Maybe you've already been using the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment with some of your learners. Maybe you've been using other digital assessment tools. If there's some data you can share that's not personally identifiable data, but kind of aggregate information across a group of learners or a population of folks, that could be really beneficial to your state as it's developing their digital plan. So that's a way you can walk in the door with an asset that they can't get anywhere else. And that will get you a seat at the table in a way that just walking in the door by itself may not. So I want to open things up for discussion. I'm interested in hearing from folks, whether you are already at the table with your peers, whether you'd like to be, but you're not yet, whether this is the first time you're hearing, and more particularly, what your biggest questions or concerns are about this topic. There's a lot that still remains unknown, and I'm going to go ahead and put my info in the chat too, so don't worry if you didn't grab it before the slides disappeared. But there are a whole lot of opportunities for you to weigh in, share your expertise, and hopefully get some new funding for adult education through all of this. So thanks to everyone who's been introducing themselves in the chat. I'm just taking a quick look through the chat to see if there are particular questions we want to make sure to answer here. Yes, Katie from Montana. We will absolutely share this slide deck with you so that you can share it with anyone else in your state. In fact, I'm going to send Sharon 2 slide decks. One is the really short set of slides that I just walked you through, and the other is a slightly longer set that gives a little more background in case that might be helpful to you as you're talking to your state agency peers. I'm also dropping in the chat our Digital Equity Act 101 fact sheet, which is sort of like the nuts and bolts of, hey, what is this legislation? And you know, what is coming down the pike with us. All right, let me see if there are other questions that are already in the chat. Let me see here. Just scrolling through chat messages here. I see a question from Maryland and Indiana. Is the BEAD planning grant for a 5-year plan like the Digital Equity Act? Yes, The BEAD planning grant is for a 5-year action plan. Yes, same time frame. Let's see if there are other questions here. Marilyn, I see you're also pointing out that state agency peers are definitely interested in the demographics of the population served by adult ed. Absolutely. So there's a list of covered populations under the Digital Equity Act, and there is terrific overlap between the people we serve in the adult education system and the people that your state is on the hook to serve under the Digital Equity Act. I mentioned some of these before, but older adults, meaning people 60 and over, people at an income level of 150% of poverty or lower, currently incarcerated folks, so those of you running correctional ed programs, people of color, people with limited English proficiency, people with low literacy skills, rural populations, and veterans are among the covered populations. So I see that there are some other comments. Katie saying that Montana Adult Ed would really like to be at the table. We need information to share with our leadership to facilitate those conversations. My hope is that some of the information I'm sharing with all of you today will do that. I'm also more than happy to chat offline with any of you who are trying to strategize about how to get a seat at the table. If perhaps your state agency folks haven't been super receptive. And I'm going to drop into the chat now another document, which is our recommendations for adult ed advocates about Digital Equity Act planning and implementation. Okay, so there are our recommendations. I am more than happy to participate offline if you want to chat or strategize. Sometimes it really helps to have an out-of-town voice come and talk. So I'm also happy to come and brief your staff or your state agency peers. Sometimes it's kind of the kiss of death to have some fast-talking lady from the East Coast parachute into a meeting. So if you don't want me there, and it's just helpful to have the information behind the scenes, I'm happy to keep it that way too. I see a couple comments in the chat for some people saying this is the first they're hearing of the two different plans. So that's, I'm glad that you're able to participate here. I see that Danielle is mentioning that New Jersey Adult Ed really needs a seat at the table and would be happy to expound on what's going on. Danielle, if you're able to share more in the chat, I think folks might be interested to hear. So please go ahead and share if there's something that you think you might be able to. I see comments here from Minnesota that it seems like perhaps Minnesota's digital equity planning is going to be led by DEED, the Department of Employment and Economic Development. I know that Eric from Literacy Minnesota is also on with us today, and Eric might have additional information to share. I'm not sure. I see a question here from Jim Spafford. Is adult education mentioned in the language of the grant? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up a different slide presentation and see if I can pull up the list of organizations that are eligible to receive funds for the federal competitive grants. Let me just get a second to open that up and I'll see if I can share that screen. So the short answer is organizations that are nonprofit organizations are eligible. Organizations that are state agencies are eligible. And so what that means is that, yeah, here, I'm going to share, I have this slide up. Let me share this screen here. Okay. Adult education can fit under multiple umbrellas, right? So again, remember that we're talking about two pots of money. One pot of money will go to the state agency that your governor appointed, and then that state agency will turn around and redistribute that money. My guess is that most states will do that through an RFP process, but that has not yet been determined. That is not decided. And your state agency could give some of that money to another state agency, right? So if your state broadband office is running the Digital Equity Act program, your state broadband office could decide that your state adult ed agency could get a chunk of that money, excuse me, or could regrant to local providers. So that's the first pot of money, right? The formula funding that your state will get that they will then turn around and regrant to the local level. But the other pot of funding is the competitive grants that you'll apply directly to the federal government for. And the organizations that are eligible to apply directly to the federal government for grants are listed on the slide here. So any state agency, any nonprofit organization that is not a K-12 school, a community anchor institution, which is defined in the law as including community colleges. So if any of you are running community college-based adult ed programs, you are on this list here. A local educational agency, an entity that carries out a workforce development program, or a partnership between any of the preceding entities. So there's a pretty long list of the types of organizations that will actually qualify to apply to the federal government. But again, we at adult education need to be sort of elbowing our way to the table, even if we are not directly being invited. Okay, other comments. I see that Connecticut has an event coming up in a few weeks and have asked adult education to send representatives, so that's exciting. Maryland, who I know is overseeing a variety of things at the Department of Workforce Development in Indiana, including adult education, says that she's serving on the Digital Equity Act task force that will be developing the 5-year DEA plan, also connected to the BEAD work, but have a ton of questions on this one. Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of us still have BEAD questions. So it looks like Will is asking, I'm struggling to sort out. So if I'm able to get involved in what is happening with BEAD in my state, that may or may not connect to what is happening with the grants in the Digital Equity Act. Correct. Some states are really tightly intertwining their BEAD and their Digital Equity Act work. And some states are putting their BEAD work over here in their broadband office and their digital equity work over here in a different office. And they're just going to say, okay, each of you come up with your 2 5-year plans, and then maybe we'll copy paste the digital equity plan into the digital equity chapter of our BEAD plan. So some states are much more integrated than others when it comes to Digital Equity Act and BEAD. And I have not yet seen data to tell me whether Washington State is integrating them or keeping them more separate. So open question, but likely to be answered in the next 3 weeks to a month, I would say. I do see a question here, whether the documents that I've put in the chat are going to also be sent out via email. Yes, I will make sure that when Sharon has the slides to send to all of you, she'll also be able to send links to the PDFs that I put in the chat. For those of you who have questions about the North Star Digital Literacy Assessment that I mentioned earlier, Eric from Literacy Minnesota, which is the developer of North Star, is actually here today, and he's put his email in the chat. We're going to go ahead and be able to let folks ask questions live if they'd like to, because we're a relatively small group. So if you'd like to be promoted to a panelist to be able to ask your question live, just put that in the chat and Sharon will make sure that happens. I see a comment here from Stephanie saying, I hear Ohio is involved and I wonder what agencies are at the table. I've not yet been asked to join any discussions. Stephanie, they just announced the agencies in a press release last night from the federal government. Let me pull up Ohio here and tell you what the agency is. Okay. Drop that link into the chat here. So this is the press release on Ohio's DEA and BEAD planning grant funds. Okay. So again, you've got some time to get your ducks in order as your state is developing its plan. Let's see, other comments here. Danielle is saying, I've reached out to the governor's office as I believe they are spearheading this, but getting responses has been difficult, and I am fearful that adult ed in New Jersey will miss out. I have not heard of any other connection to labor where I'm housed. Thank you for sharing that. Marilyn said, I understood the timeline for the planning grant and the implementation formula grant. What is the timeline for those discretionary grants? Marilyn, it's looking now that those discretionary grants would be coming out, or rather the notice of funding opportunity would be coming out from the feds in first quarter 2024. So somewhere in January through March of 2024. NTIA is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. That is the agency within the US Commerce Department that is overseeing these funds. Let's see. Marilyn says, we have BEAD questions on how these funds could be used to fund infrastructure entry-level training. Could adult education use these funds to develop IETs that meet this need? Yes, Marilyn, it is absolutely the case that that is a permissible use under the law. The BEAD NOFO, the Notice of Funding Opportunity for the Planning Grant that the feds put out earlier this year, which I can send you a copy of if you need it, explicitly said that workforce development for broadband workers is an allowable use, and there's a long list of things that qualify, and I am absolutely sure that IETs could fit under that umbrella. If you need help making that argument to your peers in state government, I'm happy to chat offline about that. Is there a list that will inform us about the state agencies working on this? Thank you, Helene, for that question. Many advocates have been pushing the federal government to release the list of the state agencies. The feds know which agency is going to be in charge for each of the 50 states. They have not yet published that list. They're kind of dragging their feet. And I don't know whether they're dragging their feet because they're worried that publishing the list means that a lot of vendors will try to contact those state officials. I don't know why they're delaying, but they promise that by the time they announce all the planning grants, they will release that list. If you don't know for your state and you want to know, feel free to circle back to me. Okay, so Sharon, I'm seeing that Marilyn would like to be unmuted so that she can ask a question. Can you promote her to panelist?
I'm trying to. I'm not sure
Okay.
why I can't do that. I know we upgraded recently to a different. Let me just see if I can.
Okay. Ashley, Wisconsin does not have a press release yet. The only two states that have press releases that have been publicly announced have been Louisiana and Ohio. And if the sort of federal government website home for all of this stuff is called internetforall.gov, and that is where you can see the notice of funding opportunity for the planning grants that your state has already responded to, because that was due back in July. Great to know, Marilyn, that in Indiana, both the DEA and BEAD applications were submitted by the broadband office, which not the case in every state, but apparently the case in Indiana. While we're checking to see if we can promote people to panelists, if other folks have questions they want to add in the chat, please feel free to go ahead and do that. I'm happy to answer more questions. I'd also just love to hear if there are things that you're seeing or hearing in your state that you're excited about, or you have questions about, or you're skeptical about. We've already heard some frustrating comments from one state saying that adult education and community college partners had collaborated on some Digital Equity Act early work, and then a business association sort of swooped in and changed things. So that was a little frustrating. So there's a question here from Tammy about whether we've heard anything about Michigan's status. The short answer is no, but the feds have promised that everybody's going to be getting their planning grant within the next few weeks. So I would expect to hear that very, very soon. If you haven't, keep your ear to the ground for sure, but it should not be very long before most states hear. If you really want to be sure that you're the first to see a press release, then you can sign up for the press releases at the internetforall.gov website that I just shared with you. There's a newsletter called Broadband USA. You'll end up getting about 2 or 3 emails a week from that listserv. So that might be tricky. Or maybe that's a volume of emails you're willing to put up with. But yeah. Okay. Can BEAD funds be used for training individuals? So that's another question from Marilyn. Maybe, but it's certainly not going to look like WIOA individual training account funds. It's not clear at this point, or at least it's not clear to me. And I have not seen clear guidance from the feds. So that is a little bit of a TBD, a to be determined. And definitely something where you want to be part of shaping your state's BEAD planning so that they have a really strong workforce development component to their plan, so that when you want to go back to them later and say, we want to use some BEAD money to pay for adult education IETs or training pathways, that you can point to the part of your state plan where they said they wanted to support that. I see that Erin is sending a chat saying that the person that Erin talked to in their state, who's leading the planning grant, was relieved to talk to someone who has worked in digital literacy and adult education. So that's great. It's nice to know that in some states there's some receptiveness that folks are hearing. Marilyn has a question here about whether folks are aware of apprenticeship programs in infrastructure. I will say there are apprenticeship programs for both broadband tower technicians and fiber optics technicians. And I will make a note to email follow up about that, because off the top of my head, I'm not remembering which states those programs are in. I think Ohio has a new program training broadband technicians. I'm writing this down so I have a follow-up. I see a comment here from Trevi saying Idaho is holding regional coordination workshops. Our community college adult education program will be at the full day coordination meeting on November 15th, and we'll do our best to advocate for further involvement of adult ed in Idaho's plan. That's great. Again, I know your Idaho librarian folks who I've met, Dylan Baker and others, are just terrific. So that is terrific. I'm seeing that we also have a private chat that we're getting from one of the attendees saying that one of COABE's student ambassadors would be a great advocate for adult education and its impact on students. We appreciate that suggestion. I know Sharon is always looking for student ambassadors for conversations with policymakers and others, and I will certainly make a note as well. So thank you for sharing that. Other questions or reactions that folks have? Interested to hear anything else. I know I threw a lot of information at you. And yeah,
Amanda, I have a question. This is Sharon. So one of the things that I hear repeatedly when I talk to business is the need for data. So for example, when I talk to T-Mobile with their $10 million initiative, or Comcast, or some of these other big organizations, they certainly, their heart goes out to the adult learners struggling, needing Wi-Fi and devices, and they certainly have funds to put towards it. And the only reason I'm bringing it up here is because COABE's been working away at a form that we'd send out to members to just start trying to get a sense of what is the need. And that's because we've been hearing from even folks on our executive committee saying, hey, if we're not starting to gather this information, it's going to be even harder when we're trying to be at the table. So I'd love your thoughts, Amanda, on that as we're working through that piece as well.
Yeah, so that is a great question. Um, the first thing I will say is any data you have is power. Data is power. Data is power in making the case to funders, to policymakers, and to the media. The second thing I'll say is you can look at your administrative data from your programs to get your first cut of data. And then you can think about whether you have time or energy to do a survey or other mechanism to gather more data. So what do I mean by looking at your administrative data, right? You likely do have information on the zip codes where your learners live and how they're participating in classes. Are they participating online and virtually? Are they participating in person, hybrid? Being able to map that kind of information can help illuminate, oh, in this particular zip code, we're serving a lot of learners via virtual services. So that might speak to the fact that those learners are well set up to participate in online learning, or it might speak to the fact that they're in a really rural location and it's hard for them to travel in person to classes, right? So being able to look at your program data as one cut at trying to understand digital access and digital skills is really powerful. I mentioned before, some of you may already be teaching digital skills classes, and perhaps you even have test data from North Star, from Google Career Certificates, from Microsoft or Cisco or some other vendor that's offering training. That data is really powerful. There is some really useful examples of survey questions from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. So if you're planning to do a survey, either of your staff or your learners, I would recommend that you don't reinvent the wheel. I would absolutely borrow from the good folks at NDIA to use survey questions that other states and localities and programs have used to understand things like whether all your learners have their own digital devices, whether they have broadband at home, what level of comfort they have with certain digital skills. So if folks are wanting to gather that kind of data, I think that is fantastic. I would just encourage you to piggyback off of work that your peers have already done, rather than try to invent it from scratch yourself. And I'm writing myself a note about this too, to share some slides I have on how you can do surveys and collect data on digital equity access. Does that answer your question, Sharon, or are there other aspects that you wanted to lift up based on your conversations with T-Mobile or others?
That's perfect. Thank you, Amanda.
Okay. Yeah, I see that Marilyn is mentioning in the chat that she's had conversations with United Way on helping with marketing and outreach. That is great. Some folks are working with the Goodwills or the United Ways or other big nonprofits in their communities. It really comes down to relationships. You know best which agencies are known and trusted by adult learners in your community. Maybe it's the K-12 school district, maybe it's the public library, maybe it is the United Way, maybe it's an ethnic or community-based organization, a labor union, who knows? So really working through those organizations can be really powerful. I know that in Seattle, the King County Workforce Board has just done a survey of workforce center staff to understand from them what they see as the biggest digital equity challenges facing the job seekers who are coming in the doors of the workforce centers. So that's another way to gather data, right, is to talk to program staff and ask them what they're seeing in the learners or the clients that they're serving. So yeah. Anything else that folks wanted to lift up? I do have one more kind of sneak peek that I can share with you, getting back to making the case to folks. So let me share screen one last time. So in January, National Skills Coalition will be releasing some new research that we partnered with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta to produce. And this new research looked at 43 million help wanted ads from last year, calendar year 2021. And in those 43 million ads, we looked at the top demanded skills and how many of those job ads were requiring a digital or likely or potentially digital skill. Almost half, 47% of all job postings nationwide require applicants to have at least one digital skill, and 91% require at least one digital or potentially digital skill, right? So a definitely digital skill is something like being able to use Photoshop, or being able to use Epic electronic health records or Microsoft Office. A potentially digital skill is something like bookkeeping, where likely in most cases these days, people are using a computer to do bookkeeping, but it's possible that somebody might still be doing it with paper and pencil, right? So that's the big finding. And this is the part that makes it relevant to adult education. These findings are still true, even for job ads that are looking for workers with a high school diploma, even for job postings with workers that have 0 to 2 years of experience. And we see that median hourly wages for jobs that require digital skills are significantly higher. They're 23% higher on average than for non-digital jobs. So this is the affirmation that there's not a lot of jobs left in the American economy that don't acquire digital skills. And so preparing adult education learners with digital skills is incredibly important in helping them meet their career goals. So as you're talking to your peers in state government, your funders and others, being able to help emphasize that adult education is an absolutely vital on-ramp for so many people on the way to the rest of the goals they have for parenting their kids and being able to help with homework, for participating in society, for getting access to telehealth and medical appointments, and particularly for their career goals. So the rest of this research will be out in January, but I'm giving you a sneak peek that almost nobody else has seen. So you're very lucky to get to see this. And yeah, Ashley, in answer to your question, the job ad analysis was conducted by my organization, National Skills Coalition, and by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. And the data will be formally released in January, and you'll see that all over our feed. So if you're on our mailing list, you'll get it. And I'm sure Sharon and I will talk about having me do a webinar for COABE or a session at the COABE conference with all the findings. So I want to go back to Tammy's question. Will there be planned templates or additional webinars to help states create plans? So the federal government, the Commerce Department's NTIA that we've mentioned before, has basically taken the position that they want to provide support to states without being too directive or burdensome. So I'm not anticipating that the federal government is issuing any kind of template that states have to use to create state plans. I do think that we can expect to see some technical assistance resources from the feds that will give the states some ideas of how they can approach it. But the federal government is not the only source of information, right? The nonprofit National Digital Inclusion Alliance that I mentioned, the National Governors Association, my own organization at National Skills Coalition, we've all put out our own versions of things to say to states, hey, as you're developing your state plan, here are some things to keep in mind, or you should include a section on this, that, or the other. So the feds have kind of released very bare bones outlines, which are reflective of what Congress put in the law. I don't know that the feds are going to ever release a full template. I do think they will release some more guidance. But even if you don't look at federal guidance, there will be some other ideas from nonprofits. Rebecca, thanks for your comment in the chat that you find the data exciting. I find it exciting too. Very, very excited about sharing it with the world in a few months. Anything else that folks have? I want to be respectful of time here, and I know Sharon may have some additional wrap-up comments she wants to make before we close out. But Anything else that folks want to either share from their states or ask about? I'm going to put my contact information in the chat here. Most of you know how to reach me, and it'll be on the slides that Sharon sends out to you, but I'm going to put it in the chat too. I often do take West Coast phone calls into the evening East Coast time, so you should feel free to contact me up until 8 p.m. Eastern if you are in a non-Eastern time zone. It's a big country. I know folks are spread out across it. Sharon, I just want to thank COABE again for convening this group and making sure that so many folks were actually able to participate in today's conversation. It is really close to my heart that I make sure that adult ed gets a real seat at the table for this process and a real chunk of this money. So thank you for helping make that happen.
Well, I want to thank you, Amanda. I mean, first of all, for the connection when we were at that National Governors Association meeting. And I think it was, as we were talking and we realized we really, and I think you even mentioned it, you were the one who mentioned we need to make sure state leaders are thinking about this. But you took it a step further, and I wanted everybody to be aware of this as well, and that is to reach out to business leaders, and ask them to encourage their governors to make sure that adult education is at the table. So we at COABE did do that. We have the wording. If you're interested, you could also do the same thing if you have business partners that you think would speak up on behalf of adult education. That's another angle, just to kind of try to push it and make sure that adult education is at the table, because we've heard so many stories about learners that need devices and they need Wi-Fi. Just 2 days ago, we have this Google Scholars program for 200 adult learners. We're given scholarships to work through 5 different potential credentials, and they start anywhere from $54,000 to over $80,000 if they can get through one of these credentials. And one of the adult learners, her biggest issue is Wi-Fi in a device right now. She has all the heart in the world. She and I just talked today, and she literally wept to me for 20 minutes talking about what she needs. And so we'll do everything we can to help her on this end, but I only tell that story because it's so real. And I hear all the time from programs that they need Wi-Fi and devices. Their learners need this. So being at the table is critical, and we know that. And Amanda, I just want to thank you for leading this charge, really helping the field to see themselves as the stimulator to get the governors thinking about them. And that's what I think all of you at the state level, the state directors, state association presidents, state advocate fellows, we need you really to get in there, follow the steps Amanda's laid out. We will put it in the follow-up email that will go out. And then if you have questions, we'll make sure that you also have Amanda's contact information, which she has so graciously provided there as well. And just know we are also here at COABE to support you as well.
Well, thank you all so much for your participation. I see one last question for Tammy here, from Tammy here. We have issues with having enough tech support to assist students with laptops. Can these funds also support increasing tech support capacity? Yes. Oftentimes those kinds of positions are called digital navigators. And yes, it is absolutely possible under the federal guidelines to use this money to support digital navigator positions, for sure. Thank you all so much. I'll make sure Sharon gets the follow-up information so she can send it out to you all early next week. And I look forward to talking with you all more.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you everybody that took the time to be here. We'll be in touch.